Welcome, everyone. I see folks coming in through the on our attendees list, so I'll give folks a minute to filter in and then we'll get started. Well, it seems like we've got a pretty good critical mass here. A few folks will probably still trickle in for the next few minutes, but I want to mind the time for everyone and I'll get us started here. I am so glad you all are joining us today for this webinar in honor of Food Waste Prevention Week. My name is Liz Miller. I'm the Senior Community Relations Manager at Spoonfuls. And before I share my screen so you can kind of see us all, I'd love to pass to my co-presenters to say hello, and then we'll jump into our presentation. So Akif, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. So I am Akif. I am a clinical fellow at the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. I'll do a little overview of the clinic a little later into the presentation, but I'll pass to Corinne right now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Corinne Shanahan. I'm a third-year law student here at Harvard Law School and a student in the Food Law and Policy Clinic this semester. Stoked to be here.
Thanks, Akif and Corinne. And I'm going to share my screen now, so please bear with me because I'm not good at talking and doing. All right, are you seeing that okay? Yeah, I see a nod. Okay, excellent. So I'll say up front that we are going to leave some time for Q&A at the end, and we hope, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go. If there's anything that feels like a really burning question, we'll take a minute to respond to that as we go, but otherwise we'll have hopefully a robust combo at the end. But we're going to jump right in here. So our presentation today is about that date, what you should but might not know about expiration dates. We'll talk today about, where food date labeling comes from, the origin of that, regulation or lack thereof in that world, the impacts that wasted food has on people, the planet, and your wallet, and what you can do about that, what you need to know to make decisions in that realm, and what the current policy landscape is around the issue of date label confusion and date label standards and how you can support. So I'll start with a bit about Spoonfuls. Spoonfuls is a food recovery organization, and through our food recovery and distribution work, as well as our education and advocacy, we're working to address the impacts on the health, environmental, and economic impacts that wasted food has on people and the planet. And we like to say that we are delivering food with purpose. This is the why. This is why we do what we do at Spoonfuls. So about 31% of food available in the US each year goes unsold or uneaten, which has a very sizable value of $338 billion, according to ReFed. Meanwhile, here in Massachusetts, 1 in 5 households is facing food insecurity, and that translates to about 1 in 10 people across the US. And food waste is the #1 material in landfills. About 80% of that food sitting, rotting in landfills is perishable food. So fruits, vegetables, meat, dairy, some of the most, high valued foods in households across the US. And as it's sitting there rotting, it's emitting greenhouse gases, including methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So this is an issue that has environmental and economic impacts, as well as really an impact on the state of food insecurity in the US. So this is how we work as a food recovery organization at Spoonfuls. Our model is a direct distribution model. So the food coming onto our trucks is in and out same day, and that ensures that we're really keeping that fresh food fresh and it's getting to folks quickly. We partner with hundreds of businesses across Massachusetts. We are mostly working in the retail space, so the vast majority of our retail partners are grocery stores, but we do work with some wholesalers and some farms as well. And our team is a fully professional team operating in a fleet of refrigerated vehicles. So that's different from a lot of food recovery orgs that use volunteers to do their food recovery work, which we love volunteers. They make the world go round. But Spoonfuls model is one that uses a professional team on the road with ServSafe certification. And we work in 4 regions across the state. And we deliver the food that we recover to community organizations. So it could be food pantries, after school programs, veterans centers, domestic violence shelters. And the food that we recover is reaching over 55,000 people each week. Last year, we recovered 5.5 million pounds. We're on track to distribute even more this year. For every 10 boxes of food we recover at Spoonfuls, 9 of them are fresh. So that's fruit, vegetables, meat, dairy, and more. And that is really our focus. Our focus is on fresh because that is the food that tends to be the first to be passed over if there's a household facing food insecurity. That's the food that's hardest to come by. It's most expensive. Your bang for your buck doesn't maybe go quite as far in some regards. So we really focus on recovering as much of that product as we can. And so our Spoonfuls work in Massachusetts, our focus here at Spoonfuls is on Massachusetts, but I really like to talk about this statistic because I think it really demonstrates the impact of food recovery at scale. So our estimates are that it would take recovering just 54% of all of the food that goes unsold or uneaten in the US every year to feed everyone who's facing food insecurity. So that really gives you a sense of the scope of the issue of wasted food and really the potential that food recovery has to both address the issue of wasted food and really tackle the issue of food insecurity in doing so. So why do we talk about date labels at Spoonfuls? There are a few reasons for that. The labels really matter for the people who are eating the food we deliver, and that's because a lot of the food we recover is food that's at or near its date. It's food that's being pulled off the shelf because that date is approaching. And we know that that food is still good, it's still safe, and we'll talk a lot more about that in this conversation today. But we want to make sure that the people who are eating our food understand that as well. We want to make sure folks understand that we are providing food we would provide to our own children, food that we believe is, that we're providing a dignified experience through the food that we're recovering. And so we feel like it's really important because of, the issue of kind of expiration dates and, the confusion there, that we are able to ensure folks that that it is food that we would provide to our own families. Moreover, date labels have an impact on the food waste issue in the United States. The average household of 4 is estimated to waste about $3,000 each year on food that they're tossing. So that's, a little under $300 a month, which is a lot of money for a lot of households. And it's estimated that about 5.8% of food that's unsold or uneaten in the US each year is the result of that date label confusion. And so at Spoonfuls, our focus is recovering good food and getting it to folks who need it, but we really care about the food waste issue broadly and reducing the amount of food that's going to waste in the US each year, keeping value in that food. So talking about date labels is one way to really heighten awareness about those issues. Very briefly, how did we get to this situation where there's so much date label confusion and, products have a variety of labels? So there is a belief that we have Al Capone to thank for the very beginning of date labels. The Chicago crime boss, I did say Al Capone. The story goes that he lobbied the Chicago legislators to pass a law putting date labels on milk because a loved one got sick from drinking sour milk, supposedly. But we can kind of zoom forward to the 1970s for maybe a little bit more context. And really, that was when date labels started become more commonplace. So that was a moment when there was a lot more processed food coming onto the market, and processed, including, like food being preserved and packaged in different ways and just processed in different ways and new ingredients. And so consumers had really concerns about the quality of that food and the safety of that food. It was just kind of a new thing. And so manufacturers and grocers started responding to that, and they started using open dating, which is as opposed to closed dating. So prior to open dating, closed dating was a method that was used for manufacturers and grocers to understand when products needed to be pulled from the shelf. And it was, essentially code that was indecipherable to the consumer, but that the grocer could use or the manufacturer could use to say, okay, we're pulling this product at this point. And then shortly thereafter, governments began responding to that consumer demand as well. And so that was the beginning of what became a patchwork of state level date label laws, and absent federal standards, kind of the beginning of it all. So we can drop in the chat a link to the NRDC piece that talks more about this history if you're interested to read it. So I'm going to pass it to Akif and Corinne to talk more about the legal side of this. Pass it to you, team.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. Hi, everyone. Again, I am Akif. As I said, I'm a clinical fellow here at the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic. And just before I go into talking a little bit about date labels, I'll just give a quick overview of what our clinic does. So first, as a law and policy clinic, FLPC provides guidance to clients who are seeking to increase access to both healthy foods and to also help reduce the waste of safe and wholesome food. Our clients at FLPC include nonprofits, government agencies, businesses, sometimes multinational businesses, and food recovery organizations like Spoonfuls, just to name a few. Also, one of the cornerstones of our work as a law clinic is to educate and train law students to use law and policy tools to help positively impact the food system. I know we already had Corinne introduce herself earlier, but just want to preface that Corinne is going to be explaining a little bit later in this conversation about the issue with state level date labeling laws. But Corinne, I'm really glad you're here with me. So as I mentioned, one of FLPC's largest portfolios is food waste and recovery. And my work at FLPC right now is focused solely on that portfolio. But that food waste and recovery work goes from both like local food waste issues all the way up to the international level. And we work with clients all throughout the food system, all the way up to the international level. And the goal of this work is to advance policies that help reduce food waste and increase the amount of unsold or surplus food that is recovered and hopefully distributed to people who are experiencing food insecurity. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So on that food waste note, I'm going to be talking today about one of the constant obstacles in food waste reduction and food recovery efforts, which is this issue of food date labeling. Also, just want to note that I'm going to be sharing a document later in the presentation with a lot of the links and the sources that I'll be talking about. So if you're looking to find them, we'll share them toward the end of the presentation. Yeah, and let me know if you have any questions, or we'll be answering questions at the end as well. So to start, as you can see on this slide in front of you, there are a variety of food date labels in the US, including some of the ones here, also some funky ones like serve before or freshest by or only freshest on. A study by Walmart found that there were at least 47 different date labels utilized just within Walmart's inventory alone. And they made a statement that there are likely more date labels in the US than just that 47 number. What's also problematic is that date labels, there are sometimes multiple labels on products. As you can see on the top right, there are two separate date labels on this one product with no indication of which one is the one that consumers should be depending on. And as Liz mentioned, if the goal of date labeling is to help inform consumers and to keep them safe, date labeling right now in the US is not doing a great job. There is such a large variety of date label options that it kind of detracts from the goal by creating a lot of consumer confusion. Okay, next slide, please. So FLPC recently did a survey to kind of get a better understanding of where consumers are on their understanding of food date labels. We partnered with ReFed and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health to get this survey done just this January, so 3 months ago. And this was an update to a 2016 survey that we had all worked on. We asked consumers in the survey about their understanding of the 8 date labels listed in the graph there to try to understand where their understanding was on these different types of date labels. Unfortunately, a lot of our results showed that consumers are still getting pretty confused about the meaning of date labels, and we actually found that confusion is getting worse. So overall, we found that 87% of consumers think or at least told us that they understand the meaning of all these date labels, but across these different date labels, only 53% of consumers provided the correct meaning. That means that 39% of consumers in this survey stated that they knew the meaning of different date labels, but were unfortunately incorrect. Okay, next slide, please. So even with consumer understanding being low and getting lower, we found in our survey that consumer reliance on date labels is actually going up. So in our recent survey, we found that 43% of consumers usually or at least or always discard food close to or past the date on the package, and 88% of consumers at least occasionally did so. Both of these numbers are higher than the numbers that we found in 2016. And I'll also note that our 2025 survey had double the amount of respondents as our 2016 survey, which just makes us feel a little bit worse about consumer understanding going lower. This reliance on date labels that we found paired with that consumer confusion leads to some of the negative impacts that Liz talked about. Next slide, please. So we know that that food waste creates a lot of problems, but date labels specifically actually lead to an enormous amount of food waste on their own. In 2023, ReFed found that 4.3 million tons of food waste in the US could be attributed just to the issue of date label concerns. That's equivalent to $22 billion in 2023 that households and businesses lost out on. That also means that food was not making its way to food recovery organizations or to food recycling or to any other beneficial use of that organic waste. And this $22 billion loss is not just accounting for, or sorry, this just accounts for the value of the food thrown out. $22 billion doesn't account for the resources that are lost in producing that food, in transporting that food, in storing that food, or in throwing that food. That includes the water that is lost, the energy that is lost, emissions created in the entire process, and not to mention the emissions released when food goes to landfill. So that's all to say that it is a pretty big problem. Next slide. So what are other countries doing about it? FLPC actually works, as I mentioned, on the international level. We're putting together this atlas called the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas that collects food donation and food waste policies across the globe. We have worked so far with 26 other countries, and we found that every single one of the countries that we have worked with so far has passed some kind of national law or policy directing the date labeling of food, except for the United States. Specifically, something useful to note is that the EU and a few other countries have also implemented a dual date labeling scheme that helps standardize the language between a quality-based date and a safety-based date. A quality date would be the date by which food is at its peak quality, but is completely safe to eat afterwards. And a safety date is the recommended discard date based on trends about when food would be unsafe. That's more specifically for foods like deli meats or food that is time temperature controlled for safety. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, a lot of other countries are working on date labeling at the national level. And US consumers also believe that this country is working on date labeling at the national level. According to our survey, we found that 44% of consumers think that date labels are federally regulated, and 21% of US consumers are unsure or confused about whether food date labels are federally regulated. The truth is that they actually are not federally regulated except for infant formula. Next slide. So to get into this a little bit more, there are no federally standardized definitions or requirements for food date labeling, which is really shocking to a lot of people that we tell this to, just because FDA and USDA are regulated. The two government agencies that regulate food here in the US are authorized to regulate food product labeling. That means that they're authorized to regulate the nutrition facts on food labels. They're authorized to regulate the language on food labels. And they do have some requirements. For example, as listed below, USDA and FDA both require all food product labels to not be false or misleading. But date labels themselves, there isn't any regulation or policy on that topic. And so while FDA regulates date labels on infant formula specifically, there are no other rules that companies have to follow at the federal level, at least, when it comes to how they label their food. They put date labels on their food. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there aren't any federal regulations on food date labels, and that has left food date labeling in the hands of states. I'll pass it now to Corinne to talk about that state date labeling.
Thanks, Akif. So as Akif and Liz mentioned, there's no federal legislation regulating date labels. And as a result, this sort of patchwork system of state laws regulating date labels has emerged. And that patchwork system has a real range of labeling requirements, from not much at all to sort of loose requirements to average, or at the far end, pretty restrictive labeling requirements. But the point is that they're all over the place without federal regulation. And that patchwork system increases the burden on manufacturers and increases confusion among consumers and retailers and restaurants about what date labels really mean, and whether food can be donated or eaten after the date on its label passes. And that all results in greater food waste, as Akif mentioned, and less ability for food to make it to the people who need it most through donations. So one way to analyze state date label laws is to compare states to the FDA Food Code, which is a model set of guidance on food safety for restaurants and retailers that states can choose to adopt, either in part or in whole or not at all. And the FDA Food Code only recommends date label requirements for certain foods, including those time temperature controlled foods, TCS foods in certain reduced oxygen packaging that allows the growth of bacteria, as well as shellfish. So ReFed, which is an org that Liz mentioned earlier, it's a nonprofit that collects and analyzes food waste data. They took date label laws from across the country and compared those state laws to the FDA Food Code. And this chart shows that states are about 50-50, either more restrictive or about consistent with the FDA Food Code. But you can see that the states are all over the place, and that's because there's no federal regulation requiring states to match the food code or employ some other date labeling system. So if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at one state in particular, and we chose to look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts is one of the states that is stricter than the FDA Food Code, which gives it a negative rating. And that means that it's more restrictive than the FDA guidance. And in fact, we found that Massachusetts is one of the most restrictive states in the country for date label laws. Massachusetts requires date labels on more food than the FDA guidance, including certain perishable foods like yogurt. And the state restricts the sale and donation of all food types after the date on the label has passed, and it's the only state to restrict all food types in that way. And the law does have some exceptions in Massachusetts for how past date foods can be sold. but it doesn't mention how to donate past date foods. And because it doesn't mention donations at all, it's pretty unclear whether those rules also apply to donations or whether you can do it at all. And that means retailers and restaurants are sort of left in the lurch, not really knowing whether they can donate past date foods or whether there are additional requirements for those kinds of donations. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that this patchwork system I mentioned is continuing to evolve, but it's not necessarily evolving in a consistent direction. Pending date label legislation is fairly inconsistent across states. Some states are even feeling frustrated that the federal government is failing to act in this area. So in California, last year, the state passed a resolution calling on the federal government to standardize date labels. And after a few months with no action, California said, okay, we'll do it ourselves, and passed the legislation on its own. Massachusetts is considering legislation to standardize date labels as well. But the law uses different languages than California. But it's also worth noting that the legislation Massachusetts is considering is not designed to make the state laws less restrictive than they already are. And other states, where other states might be reducing those restrictions, Massachusetts appears to be moving in the opposite direction. And the last example here, Oregon is considering a law on perishable foods, which would subject those foods to greater requirements and limit the ability of retailers and restaurants to donate those foods, like we saw in Massachusetts. Worth noting again also that this legislation is consistent or inconsistent with other states too in relation to the language that would be required for the labels. Another way that companies and players in the market have filled the void of no federal regulation has been through voluntary standards, which if you go to the next slide, I'll pass it back to Akif to talk about.
Well, thanks so much, Corinne. So I'm just going to mention some voluntary standards that were put into place to try to combat this issue of food date labeling. So back in 2017, there was both a domestic and an international effort by industry to try to standardize date labeling. One was the GMA and FMI voluntary standard, which tried to create a dual date labeling system for companies to use, using the best if used by label for quality labels, and then the use by language for discard labels. And then on the international level, Champions 12.3 and the Consumer Goods Forum Board of Directors made a call to action, asking companies across the world to simplify date labels and to help educate consumers. One of the issues with voluntary standards, even those recommended by the government as noted below, where FDA and USDA recommend best if used by, is that a lot of state level date labeling laws, as Corinne mentioned, are pretty restrictive for different date or for different food products. And so even when companies want to implement voluntary standards to try to make all of their food labels similar or recognizable or use two phrases, specific date label laws don't allow that. Our research has shown that half of the states in this country have date label laws that directly obstruct these voluntary standards from going into place. And so while we applaud the efforts of industry and government to create these voluntary standards, we need something that can help preempt state date labeling laws so that consumers can not feel all that confusion and food doesn't go to waste. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our three main solutions for this date labeling issue. One, as mentioned multiple times in this presentation, standardizing date labels is a necessary step to get started. That means limiting date labels in this country to only two phrases, either best if used by for quality date labels and used by for safety date labels. That would reduce consumer confusion, get rid of a lot of the extraneous language on the market that doesn't provide anybody with useful information, and gives consumers, companies, and food recovery organizations a good point of a common understanding so that they know what actions they can take with their food. Next, we ask that, or we recommend that sale and donation of food that is only past the quality date should be explicitly allowed. This is because food that passes the quality date is completely safe to eat. It might be past its peak quality, but there aren't any safety concerns that anybody has to worry about. And so after standardizing date labels, allowing food to be donated or sold past the quality date would reduce the amount of food that is getting thrown out unnecessarily. Finally, we recommend increasing education and awareness for consumers. While standardizing date labels is important and explicitly allowing sale and donation is important, if consumers don't know that date labels have changed or that there is a quality date to follow or a safety date to follow or the meaning of those, it doesn't really go anywhere. And so we recommend that the federal government and industry put money and effort into educating and creating awareness for consumers. Next slide. So just to end off this date label conversation with some things that are happening to try to get us to our solutions, I want to talk about the pathways to federal standardization. So one is the federal agency action option, which is USDA and FDA using their statutory authority to regulate date labels. As mentioned, they both have the authority to regulate food product labels anyways, and so date labels fall under their purview and they can take regulatory action to regulate date labels and make them clearer. On the other side, on the legislative side, there are two different ways that we can get to standardization. One, as Corinne mentioned, there is some state level date labeling legislation that is pending. Right now, there are 9 states that have introduced date label bills. And California actually previously, before introducing its standardization bill, had put out a resolution that called for federal action. Getting involved at the state level, trying to create standardization bills or pass these resolutions is a really great step because it shows that states are behind this problem, and also companies can start adapting early on to what that standard language would look like, which would decrease the barrier for the federal government to pass that standardization. Another side of legislative of action is the federal side. One example of this is the Food Date Labeling Act. It was a bill that has been introduced in every single Congress since 2016 that meets all 3 of the recommendations and solutions that we had just mentioned. While the FDLA has not yet been introduced this Congress, we're hopeful that it's going to be introduced really soon. So all that to say, food date labeling is a big problem that leads to a lot of food waste, but there are paths forward. And Liz is going to be talking a little bit more about that engagement. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Akif. Thanks, Corinne. So yeah, I think, that was a lot of conversation about sort of where we're at in the policy world and the legislative world. And perhaps some of you are thinking like, what can I do about this? So I want to take just a couple minutes to go over that. So I think first and foremost, if you take anything away from this session, I hope it is that you remember that you can rethink date labels and really think twice before you toss something just because of the date. And this here is the guidance that Spoonfuls provides to our the partners who receive food from us to distribute. And we, again, do that so that they understand that we feel confident that the food is safe and still good quality for distribution. And this is absolutely something that anybody can use at home. So you'll see on here, it says, above all, use your senses. And some people say, look, smell, taste, don't waste. So kind of really, give a look, give a sniff, give a little taste. Food is pretty good at letting you know when it's gone bad, like stinky milk or moldy bread or slimy deli meat. So, those senses are really quite trustworthy, but this guidance is also another great way to feel confident that you can maybe not toss that food just because of the date. And we can drop in the chat a link for you to access this. And we're also happy to put some in the mail if you would like one, or if you have folks in your network that you think might want one of these, or you'd like to distribute some, let us know in the chat, and we're happy to send some your way. This is available in like a magnet form, so you can stick it on the fridge, which is a great spot to leave it. And then another way that you can support improving this issue is talking to your legislators about the Food Date Labeling Act that Akif mentioned. So again, it really would standardize and clarify date labels. And I can say from anecdotal conversations and presentations I've done, these labels feel like really valuable because, I often give folks various food packages and I say, like, what do you think best by means? And people do, it clicks like best is something about this is still good after this date. It's just maybe not at its, peak freshness. And so I'm excited by moving towards standardizing to these terms, one for safety, one for quality. And so Akif mentioned the Food Date Labeling Act has been introduced into Congress every session for the past many. It hasn't been introduced this time, but we fully expect that it will be. And so you do not need to wait for this to be introduced to call your legislators. You can call today. I mean, you can wait until it's introduced too, but there's no reason why you can't pick up the phone and call your legislators and tell them you want the Food Date Labeling Act to be passed this session. There's a link here for you to find your members of Congress. If you need that information, we'll drop that in the chat. And if you're feeling intimidated about that, which I know a lot of people sort of, calling my congressperson, that feels kind of scary. Spoonfuls has an advocacy toolkit. We'll drop the link to that in the chat as well. And we have a spotlight in there for talking with government. But I'll just offer that legislators, as well as the people who work for them, who are often the ones picking up the phone, are people too. So, just remember that, it's a human on the other end of the phone. And I find that reassuring. It feels a little bit less intimidating, but it is absolutely something that if they hear from you, it has an impact. And I'll note too that food waste legislation is a bipartisan issue. Food waste is a bipartisan issue. So this bill was introduced by Senator Blumenthal, who's a Democrat, and Representative Pingree, who's a Democrat last session. But it then garnered bipartisan support in the House. There are other food waste related bills on the docket in Congress now and over the years that have garnered a lot of bipartisan support. There's economic impacts that, everybody can relate to with respect to food waste. And then, the food security and climate pieces garner support in many spaces as well. But it is absolutely something that's bipartisan, which I think is really like a bright spot right now. We can be excited that, no matter what state you're in, calling your legislator can have an impact on this bill. So highly recommend that. And then last but not least, please spread the word. I suspect that there are some folks on this call for whom this information was really kind of enlightening today. I know it was for me when I first came to understand it. And I find in every presentation where I talk about this, people are shocked. So spread the word. I think like the more people know about this, the closer we'll get to really like changing this situation. And, it has an impact on people, it has an impact on the planet, and it has an impact on your wallet. So I think, if we can, push those messages through, it can be valuable. And you can definitely find Spoonfuls and the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic on socials. And we talk about this a lot on there. So please do follow us and stay connected to stay informed. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to hopefully stop talking for a couple minutes, and we'd love to take your questions now. And I do see some coming through. So we can start with, there was a question from Hannah early on regarding the Massachusetts. Oh, wow, we have so many questions. Thank you, everyone. I'm just backing up to that question that we got early on from Hannah about the Massachusetts law. And the question is, and so I think this is one for you, Akif and Corinne. Any ideas why Massachusetts is more strict with its date label regulations than the FDA standards are? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll say I don't have specific knowledge about like Massachusetts, like the regulatory history, but just kind of an overview answer is that the FDA has put out this model food code, but it's not actually a required law by the FDA. It's instead recommended guidance. And every state in the country has adopted some part of the FDA Model Food Code, except for California. But even California has regulations that basically mirror some of the FDA language. But the issue, so like Massachusetts is, I don't want to call it like a problem, but Massachusetts is just one state that has a unique regulatory history. A lot of date label laws, because there isn't a federal standard, have just kind of been put together in a piecemeal fashion when issues come up state by state. Some other examples that I can give, like while Massachusetts has this phrase perishables in its state label law that no other, like only I think Oregon has, other states have very specific date label regulations because of industry in that state or farming practices. One example that comes to mind is that Montana has like a really, really specific dairy product regulation, specifically like milk in Montana needs to be sold within 12 days, which doesn't like it, there's no basis in the law like explaining the science behind it. It's just the way that the law works, and each state has its own history with why different regulations are in place. But since there is a state by state situation, yeah, it just kind of it gets confusing both for people like moving between states, and then also like if a dairy company wants to sell milk in Montana and also Massachusetts and also New York, it has to track and change all of its date labels, or it usually, and this what usually happens is that companies stick with the strictest date label law that they work under. That way they don't violate any laws, but that leads to a lot more food waste. But I would recommend looking into Massachusetts like regulatory history and understand, like to read up about why their products are labeled in that way.
And I'll just follow up on that Montana milk piece. The clinic, the Food Law and Policy Clinic, did a really great video a few years ago. It's called Expired question mark. If you Google it with the term Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic or Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, it should come up. And it's a really nice overview of this. I see a hand raised from Alexandra, but I'm not actually sure how to help Alexandra chime in. So I don't know if maybe either my team can send me a Slack on how to do that, or Alexandra, if you want to drop your question in the chat. And while we're figuring that out, yeah, because I don't see a way to like get
I
your
think
voice.
I think I'm able to speak.
Hello, there you are. Hi. I'm glad you could figure it out.
Thank you very much. So my question, I guess, is a bit more specific. I really appreciate all the information about policy. So my mother-in-law is moving, and we cleaned out her pantry of 45 years worth of things. And the dates, I mean, obviously the dates didn't all match up on anything, but in terms of jars and cans, even if they looked okay, if the labels were like clearly made in like the 80s or 90s, we opted to throw them away. Is there like some kind of a, I saw it said only if cans are dented or swollen, but is there like a rule of thumb as to like if something is like a certain amount of years old, no matter what it is, it should get tossed? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think certainly like the guidance that Spoonfuls provides would say to toss something that's many years old. And yeah, I don't know that there's a rule of thumb. I mean, I think Spoonfuls guidance could be kind of a rule of thumb for some things, but to your point, the there's like an issue of denting, and that's an issue of like the food being contaminated regardless of date. That's why dents on cans are an issue. But yeah, I would say something that's in the range of years old is probably something that needs a decade old. I would suggest tossing, and somebody in the chat made a very good point. You could compost the contents of that. Nothing's too old for a compost bin as long as you can stand the smell. If it's a decade old, I wonder what what you might see when you open it. But I think I'll just harken back. There is the look, smell, taste, don't waste question, and I can't speak from experience if something 10 years or 20 years or older would pass that test, but yeah, it's a great question. I think you did the right thing by not trying to consume that food in particular, and compost is always a good option for that. But that I'm sure that was quite an exercise, Alexandra. I bet you saw some really interesting things in that search. Um, this is a question about the Food Date Labeling Act. The question is, are there any reasons why it's been passed over all these years? Wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a frustrating thing that we get bipartisan support, we have bicameral bills with the State Labeling Act. Everybody we talk to loves it. The real problem is, like, if we're being honest, is the Farm Bill has not been passed, like a new Farm Bill hasn't been passed since 2018. And the Food Date Labeling Act, when it was first introduced, was kind of new on the scene. People didn't really understand it. So that kind of got passed over in 2016, 2017. Or sorry, 2017, 2015, 2016. It was introduced late in that Congress. And then the next Congress, when it was introduced as a marker bill in the Farm Bill. And then the Farm Bill has, as you all know, the 2018 Farm Bill is the only Farm Bill, like the most recent one that has been passed, and it's been renewed instead of being updated. And so our goal every time is putting the Food Date Labeling Act into the Farm Bill to get it passed. It just has not. And so that's the goal again. This time, getting the Food Date Labeling Act passed. We've tried, or like FLPC has supported some efforts to try to get the Food Date Labeling Act passed as its own standalone bill. But there isn't some overwhelming need or want for it. And we think there should be, and we like have been putting in a lot of effort to try to educate legislators on why this should be a standalone bill, like why it should pass. But yeah, it's just been a lot of like procedural issues trying to get this FDLA passed. And we're still, and like whenever Congress gets renewed, we have new Congress people, and so we put in the effort to try to educate the new Congress people coming in. And it has been overwhelmingly positive. It's just the process of getting stuff passed takes a while.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too. I think food waste has really, like, policy to address it has really garnered a lot of momentum in recent years. Like, there's been more bills coming on. I feel like it's getting more attention in the public sphere. So yeah, a lot of legislation is this way. It just really takes time, and hopefully that momentum will help us out this time around. I want to jump on the question from Kate. The question is, do you have any resistance from folks you're partnering with and or their clients accepting the guidelines that Spoonfuls provides? And she adds that they struggle with that. They struggled with that at a previous org she worked at. And definitely Spoonfuls experiences that as well. It's why we provide this guidance in part, because we do get that question a lot. Some folks really are just not willing to take things that are past date. And we respect that, you know, if folks are concerned about that, then folks are concerned about that. But when we do get that resistance, our team works to really kind of clarify, you know, our standards and this kind of information, and really elaborate on the understanding that, in fact, those dates are, you know, typically not about safety, and we feel very confident in the quality of the food that we're providing. I know that, you know, every time I do a presentation on this topic, people are like, oh, wow, okay, I'm going to rethink this. And I think if we had the bandwidth to do this presentation with every single one of our partners, it would have a really positive impact. But yeah, the guidance that we provide is very much to kind of help folks feel more confident about that. And it looks like we have time for maybe just one other question. And there was a question about leftover meals from restaurants. Any thoughts on leftover meals from restaurants? And I suspect the question there is related to what do we do about that source of waste, of food waste? Certainly, if you have leftovers on your plate, highly recommend you take those home and eat them. Eating leftovers is one of the most effective interventions to reduce food waste. A study a couple years ago, a Miter-Gallup study, which we can share in the chat, the link to that, found that to be the case. But as far as like recovering leftovers from restaurants, it's not something Spoonfuls does, but it's something that other orgs do. We certainly can't recover food that was on somebody's plate that was served and may have been contaminated. But if restaurants prepared excess food and never put it out for service, there are organizations that can recover some of that food. So it's absolutely a source of waste and a place where recovery can happen. And we're at time. So, I know that there are some other questions coming through, and we're going to take all of the feedback here about magnets, and we will reach out to folks who have expressed interest. Thank you for dropping your address in there if you already did, and we can connect with you via email if you didn't. And we will, if there are any other burning questions in here that we didn't get to, we will be sending a follow-up email with all of the resources we shared today. So we can try to kind of tackle some of those questions in the chat too, if there are any like really burning ones that we didn't get to. But so grateful for everyone's participation today. This has been really fantastic. Thank you, Akif and Corinne, for your expertise today. It's very much appreciated. And you all will hear from us with more following up. And so glad that you could join us today. So I'll just put on the screen here, if anybody wants it right now, this is contact for Akif, Corinne, and myself, and we will include these slides in our follow-up as well. So you can reach out to us if you want to learn more, if you want to talk more about this. As you can tell, we like talking about this topic. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.